So being a feminist was completely natural to me. It's the way I thought, it's the way I saw things. I had a lot to learn. There were no women's studies courses, of course, all through university. So there was a lot that I didn't grapple with, I didn't understand as part of feminist theory, but there was a lot that I could see. At the very beginning of my journalism career, I wrote for the Globe and Mail as a reporter and then a feature writer. And I did tackle what were, in essence, feminist subjects. I wrote a huge series about the life of nurses and how badly they were paid and how the hierarchy crushed them when they had so much to contribute. This was in 1963. At that time, I was so shocked to discover that the elevator operators, there was such a thing as people who stood in the elevator and pressed the right button for you. Elevator operators in hospitals were paid more than registered nurses. My anger about inequality just fueled me through the years. And then I quit the Globe and Mail to go home and have babies. And when I returned to work part-time, it was at Chatelaine under the great leadership of Doris Anderson, who made feminism accessible to all Canadian women across the country. She really did a wonderful job of blending feminist analysis into the magazine along with recipes and fashion and how to budget and all those practical things. She never discounted the real domestic life of women, but she tried to introduce gradually and moderately these woman-centered ideas and analysis. So I wrote about abortion. I wrote about all those feminist subjects for Chatelaine. And then Doris said to me, there's a shelter for women, for battered women. That's what we called them, battered wives, opening in downtown Toronto. And I think you ought to do a story about this. So I really knew nothing about this problem at all. It was an invisible problem. Our family actually had a couple who were friends of the family, where the wife would often turn up with a black eye and some excuse. We just overlooked it. We knew that her husband was hitting her, and it was just normal. So I went to Interval House. That was a big old house in downtown Toronto. I went with all my middle-class assumptions. I said, oh, it must be mostly poor women in this situation. You know, I couldn't imagine that anyone with resources would stay in that situation. I had no understanding of the emotional dynamics, the control factor, and the brutalizing that would go on. I really didn't understand it, and Trudy explained it to me. Tried to remove several layers of my ignorance. I went back and wrote about it. It was really enlightening for me. So from then on, I had a special loyalty to Interval House as the great pioneer in this. And nowadays, a lot of shelters exist that have absolutely no feminist analysis, which to my mind is heartbreaking. Heartbreaking, because you're sheltering women from the harm, but you're not equipping them with the analysis to go on in their lives in a safer way, in a better way. But Interval House had that feminist analysis and stuck to it despite the societal pressures. And I remember how poor Interval House was. At that time, the way a shelter or a hospital would survive was by a daily allowance from the welfare department per capita. So it was something ridiculous, like $6 a head per diem. And they weren't getting it. They weren't entitled to it at the beginning. So I joined in that fight to get them, writing about it in the Star. By then I was a columnist at the Star, and I would write about the need for a better system of payment for the shelters. And very gradually that improved. But Interval House was always broke and desperately trying to spread the peanut butter thinner, you know. I remember one campaign I tried to drum up is someone at Interval House called me and said, you know, it's horrible. The roof is leaking. The water's pouring down into one of the bedrooms. So we can't use that bedroom. We're so short on space. What can we do? So I wrote a column about Interval House roof needs fixing. Let's do it. And Julie White, I can't remember the title she had, but she was doing the charitable work that Levi Strauss did at that time. And she called me up and said, we're going to fix the roof. And I was so thrilled. That was just this simple thing, appealing to the public. We got the roof fixed. It was bit by bit like that, you know. It was scrambling all the time, scrambling. Several times I would go to interview women at Interval House. My big effort was to try and make the public understand sympathetically. The question was always, well, why does she stay with a guy who beats her up? And I always said, but the question is, why does he hit her? Not why does she stay? I can tell you why she stays. She has nowhere else to go. She's scared she'll lose the kids. He threatens to kill her. There are a million reasons why she's too frightened to leave. But why does he get away with hitting her in the first place? So I was constantly trying to raise that aspect of the problem. And that's why I kept circling back to the subject and using Interval House as my resource. They would call me and say, you know, we're starting our fundraising campaign. Could you come and interview? We have several women who are willing to talk to you, and we think their stories are powerful and will move the public to support us. So it was that kind of thing. So those stories affected me very deeply too. It was so painful to hear those stories. I couldn't abide the injustice. The biggest injustice as the years went on, and you know what, and it's still going on today, 50 years later, that women who were battered by violent men had to share custody with them. How can a man who hits his wife even once ever have access to his kids? I mean, that just outrages me. And right now there's an attempt to change the law to toughen up the access rules after so many men have vengefully killed their own children because the courts gave them access even though they were violent. So that custody issue was a very big one for me. The children were being exposed to violence, even if they only saw the violence and they weren't directly battered themselves. This is life-changing. It's life-altering, life-harming to them to watch their mothers being hurt. I saw how very often the little boys identified with the batterer. They wanted to be the strong ones when they grew up. Sometimes they were very affected by their mother's hurt and sided with her, but it was scary to see how boys wanted to fall into the conventional male model. So all that had to change from the ground up, and I'm not sure how far we've gotten on that. Overwhelmingly, the male was women gasping with relief that someone heard them and saw them. Oh my God, I love you so much, Michele. You've told my story. This is my truth. You know, it was huge for them to see their reality mirrored in the media. Then there were men, some men who agreed with me and wanted to support me, and there were some men who were vile. You see their equivalent today in the online hatred, the sort of, you should be raped, you know, all that stuff. I got some of that. Mostly the response was very affirmative. And then there were those who preferred to remain undisturbed by reality. You know, well, that's the way it's always been. Men are stronger and they have to teach their wives to blah, blah, blah. You know, I was just sickened by those letters, but I developed a mantra. No one gets a free pass out of the culture. We've all drunk in the culture where domination is a big theme of romantic love. throughout our whole lives. We've read those romantic novels. Nobody is entirely free of those until they do the work of getting rid of those preconceptions and those ideas. And maybe sometimes you can never get rid of them, but you can be aware of them, of their impact on you. So I was not surprised to hear women defending some of this stuff, this awful stuff. I think the media are hugely important. So when the Globe and Mail did a whole series about rape and how badly the police react to violence against women, that's very, very important. All the media have stepped up their game on this. Not everyone, but but a lot of the media have realized they must have female reporters. They have to have someone paying attention to women's issues. Yeah, I think the media are hugely important. I think they've often failed. I got a lot of support from the Star when I wrote for them for 25 years. I did the feminist column in the Star. And I think it made a huge difference. A lot of the issues that are taken for granted today, I'm proud to say I was one of the first to write about them, the first to expose them. And the more I hammered away at them, the more they became more accepted in the newsroom and beyond. I do remember when I wrote about marital rape, there was a famous case in Oregon, a terrible case where a couple was separated and he came back and brutally raped her with their 2-year-old in the room. And then he dragged her out into the public and battered her in the park. It was a horrible case. And he got off because a man was entitled to have sex with his wife. I wrote an indignant column about it, and I looked into Canada's laws, and there was no protection for a woman from marital rape. She could not go to police and say, my husband raped me. And that law took a very long time to change. And in the newsroom, there were men who came over and screamed at me. There was one guy came over and he pounded my desk so hard the papers were jumping, off the desk. And he said, you mean to tell me that I can't have sex with my wife whenever I want it? And I said, well, if your sex life depends on rape, the answer is no, you're not entitled. But he was enraged by that. There was, for example, a rape squad at the Toronto Police, a newly formed thing. They were very proud of it. This was in about 1979. And I was very interested to interview them. So I did. And these 2 cops came down to the Star, and we sat there in the cafeteria, and they told me, well, most rapes these reports are unfounded. I said, unfounded? What does that mean? Well, say a girl goes on a picnic with a guy and then they have sex and she calls it a rape. Well, she went on the picnic. That was their first example. Or if a girl hitchhikes, well, And on they went, giving me these examples of the girl's fault in going along with some guy. And they called all those rapes unfounded, and they weren't going to investigate them. That wasn't really a rape. I was so shocked. I did a huge story on it. The Star played it above the fold, front page. I was very pleased to try and deconstruct what the cops were doing and let the public know how wrong it was. But I had to come back to that theme over and over again. In fact, the Globe did a huge takeout on this when in the 2000s. It hadn't changed at all since when I did it in 1979. Oh, sexual harassment. I remember when that book came out by a couple of Canadian women. And I thought, sexual harassment? What the heck is that? I started reading the book. I thought, well, that's ridiculous. That never happened to me. And then I thought, wait a minute. Oh, yes, it did, over and over again. professors, newsroom managers, whoever had authority over me. Sexual harassment had happened, and I just thought it was life, and I just carried on, defended myself as best I could, but never put a name to it and never saw it as an injustice. We were told to appreciate the compliment of a man being attracted to us. So sexual harassment was a big one that people didn't accept for a long time. So all these things were hard-won battles. They were not a simple matter of exposing it and everybody went along with it. You had to come back to it over and over again, find other ways to reach the readers, get their minds open to it. Yes, this happens. It's unjust. It shapes the lives of women. It diminishes our lives in so many ways, and it has to stop. I was angry to see this. Well, I kind of knew this problem was still there after all these decades. Angry and frustrated about it, glad to see it being exposed again. Same with the Me Too movement. It was regarded as something so new. I thought, what? But thank goodness for it. Thank goodness someone put a hashtag to it. And all sorts of women could feel safe enough to come out and say what had happened to them. I retired a couple of years before, I had to, because I was just tired of writing the same thing over and over, finding new ways to say these things. And the 90s were a bad time for feminism. Young women were so misled, and the media were very culpable in this. Anything new, of course, the news is about what's new. By now, feminism wasn't new. They didn't notice that everything they thought was a big statement of independence was exactly what men wanted. Sexy dressing, hookup culture, readily accessible women on demand. So it was a very dismaying time to watch young, intelligent women being swept up into all sorts of silly behaviors, silly cultural beliefs. But the Me Too movement turned that back because there was so much aggression happening, so much injustice, so much harassment, that finally someone was putting a name to it again and dragging it into public view. It had to happen. I predict that we'll be doing this for millennia, because truth, women are the one who have babies. Not all women, of course, but we're the ones who gestate and need protection and support while our infants are young, and it makes us vulnerable. We learn to depend on men in a way to protect and support us during those vulnerable times. And that sort of seeps out into the rest of our life, to thinking of men being our protectors. We have to get past these corny beliefs. Oh boy, can I tell you how far we've come. The majority of women in this country understand the basic emotional truths around rape, around custody. If somebody harasses them, whether they're empowered enough to take action against it, they know it's harassment. When I was a young woman, we didn't know it was harassment. Men were entitled to do this, and we had to take it like it or not. That's the way it was. That's just huge to have made this progress. So when I look at the overall scene, I am not downhearted. There was a time when Interval House was the only shelter for battered women. And now there are several hundred, I think, in Canada, and always full. So yeah, we have to change them in, but societal awareness has come so far. What gives me hope is how many women there are who call themselves feminists. There was a long period when the media tried to make that a dirty word. We've come past that. And there are lots and lots of women, I would say the majority, who understand the key issues about women's rights and women's fight for equality. The younger generation a lot of them really get it. What gives me a shred of hope is the level of activism among the young, and not just the young, many, many ages. The fact that there's activism means that people aren't giving up, that change is possible. Happy birthday. I'd say thank you. Thank you for all the work you've done, that hard, hard work. And you kept on, you persevered. What a service to women you have provided. And the last thing I would say is, please keep your feminist glasses on. Without the feminist analysis, you're not doing the work. So I'm proud of Integral House for keeping that feminist analysis. And I implore you, don't ever let it slip, because that's what gives you strength and gives meaning to societal change. You can do it. You have done it. You have affected society, and you only do it by wielding this wonderful weapon we have, feminist thinking.